Welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast, as always curated by Monocle Solutions. South Africa needs growth, above all else, with the capital G. But at the centre of all of that lies entrepreneurship. That's why the recently published Global Entrepreneurship Monitor report is so important. And this week we unpack the findings, which should worry all of us. Well, South Africa has an entrepreneurship problem, just not the way we usually told we have. We don't suffer from a shortage of ambition, ideas, or sheer bloody mindedness. You spend time in any township or industrial park or university incubator or family-run business, and you'll find people making plans, finding customers, keeping companies alive under conditions that would test a much larger balance sheet. The problem is what happens between the idea and the institution, between starting and surviving, and then between surviving and scaling a business. The latest South African report from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor gives the country's entrepreneurial environment a score of just 3.9 out of 10. That's seventh from the bottom among the 56 economies assessed, and well below the global average of 4.7. By way of comparison, India scores 6.1, Indonesia is around 5.8, China scores 5.4, while the UAE leads at 7.1. We're at 3.9. Now, comparisons are never perfect. South Africa isn't Dubai or Delhi or Jakarta, but that is also rather the point. The report argues that these differences cannot simply be explained away by income, geography, or the supposed temperament of South Africans. They reflect rather a range of choices: functioning digital infrastructure, simpler registration and compliance, better coordinated support programs, more accessible finance, and a culture in which building a business is regarded as a serious economic vocation rather than a desperate alternative to unemployment. Now, to unpack all of this and ultimately where we go, and to ask, how we can move from beyond learning to hustle harder to creating an ecosystem that really supports entrepreneurship, it's a great pleasure to welcome Angus Bowmaker-Falconer, Research Fellow at Stellenbosch Business School and co-author of the report, and Professor Natanya Meyer, Acting Chair in Entrepreneurship Education at the University of Johannesburg. And I must say at the start that the research report was done in partnership by Stellenbosch Business School, the University of Johannesburg, as well as Northwest University and the Small Enterprise Development and Finance Agency. So a true cross-academia and public sector collaboration, which is great to see. Angus, Natanya, welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast. Angus, let me just start and maybe begin with you with the headline number. That score of 3.9, seventh from the bottom, and virtually no movement in 5 years. Is the correct description underperformance, or is South Africa's entrepreneurial ecosystem just now structurally stuck?
I think that South Africans are entrepreneurial, and I think that we underestimate the informal sector, and I think that we do many things that are unique in South Africa, pretty much like Nigeria, actually. So I don't think we're a country that's underperforming entrepreneurially. Where I think we battle is that the government is totally committed to small business development, and they don't do a very good job at delivering that. I think that our banking system is not supporting the entrepreneurial culture of this country. And so we need to change the way we think about making businesses successful in South Africa. And we're not going to, Checkers is not going to employ more people. We need to build businesses from the ground up.
I think that is the bottom line. And Natanya, before we get into the mechanics of the index, because I think it's important to understand, just at a headline level, and to build on what Angus is saying, the report insists that South Africa doesn't lack entrepreneurial potential. It's not an underperformance from that perspective. We often, and I think too frequently, describe South Africans as resourceful and resilient. It's in our DNA. Hulle weet nie wat ons weet nie. It sounds positive, but I think it can also conceal some institutional failure underneath. For you, what is the headline finding from this year's study?
Yeah, I totally agree with your fantastic introduction. I mean, you couldn't have said it better than what we're going to do. And I agree with what Angus also said. And you said it so nicely a few sentences ago. South Africans are resilient. So we need to remember two things. There's always a push and there's always a pull factor to why people start businesses. So what we do see is, if we look from the positive side and the pull factor, lots of people spot opportunities because we have so many problems. Remember, if you have a problem in a country or in a community or a town or a city or whatever the case may be, there's an opportunity for a business to solve that problem. So because we have so many socio-economic problems and other problems in our country, there is a magnitude of opportunities for the positive entrepreneur who's chasing opportunities to start new businesses. So that's the one aspect. And we've got lots of them. Then we have the other aspect, which unfortunately is sometimes seen as a negative, where people enter into entrepreneurship out of purely necessity. We know our unemployment rate is extremely high. We've seen what's been happening with our economic growth rate over the past years. It's really been dismal. We know that there is challenges out there for a lot of South Africans, and often the only option is to try and survive is through, getting something and selling it. And this might not be the ideal circumstance. However, what we do see often is that many of these micro enterprises that start out of necessity bring so much positive energy and positive aspects to a local community that we cannot see them fail, even if they're just supporting themselves, maybe one family member and 2 or 3 community members with a small income. These are the people that are actually keeping the communities within these poorer areas afloat. And these are the people that we need to really, really reach out and support. And I'm not saying the bigger, small, medium, even the larger enterprises shouldn't be supported. Of course, they also need to be supported. But the fact of the matter is we need to take care of these rural micro entrepreneurs, because they are really not only bringing income to their own lives, but also supporting the communities they are in. And I think that's extremely important.
Yeah, very, very good point. And, when we talk about entrepreneurship, it can mean so many different things to so many different people. You get scale-ups, you get entrepreneurs that are raising Series A, B, and C rounds of funds, and can often go on to become the next Naspers, for example, the next Tencent, the next big listed company, or you just get entrepreneurs who are employing a couple of people in a spaza shop in a township. And I think both are important in the South African context. Speaking of context, the National Entrepreneurship Context Index is really the main measure here. What exactly are you measuring before we begin quoting the rankings and that kind of thing? Just to better understand, Natanya, exactly how the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor Index is put together.
Okay, so what we do is 13 indicators. It's actually 9 with a few sub-indicators, but it equates to 13 at the end, have been sort of identified that needs to be present within an ecosystem or environment to ensure that businesses are conducive and that, there's an enabling environment for them to, you mentioned it earlier, start, survive, and thrive, scale. That's what we need to see. So we measure these 13 indicators, and I'll quickly run through them. Government policy support and relevance, government entrepreneurial programs, ease of entry, entrepreneurship education at school, post-school level, research development, taxes and bureaucracy, which also links to government support, physical infrastructure, entrepreneurial finance. We know finance is a critical aspect, commercial and professional infrastructure, of course, physical, I've mentioned, social and cultural norms, and ease of entry into the market. So that's in a nutshell what we measure. Just to also come back to how we measure it, and I think this is a very important aspect. It's not Angus and myself or Angus and me and someone in the report that's written that comes up with these figures, or just, we really go, that's why it's called the National Expert Survey. So we actually draw from experts in these fields. So someone from finance who works in this industry, someone in the government who's sitting in this sphere and in this scope, and we get their input. So these are the people on a daily, day-to-day basis who's actually involved within this domain, within the ecosystem, and we get their feedback. So it's not just an assumption that we are making up. And so that's very important. Then what we do, each one of those 13 indicators has of course, a measurement, and that's done through an extensive questionnaire measuring or asking quite a lot of stuff on these different aspects. And then we combine them into an aggregate index, and this is what gives us the NECI. So if we look at the 3.9 out of 10, it's basically 13 indicators added together, divided by 13, and that's our very straightforward, unweighted index. And of course, you've mentioned a few of the countries that we compared to in this specific survey. There was 56 other countries globally. So it's not every country in the world because it's quite a tedious process to go through this. But we normally don't compare ourselves with the United Arab Emirates or first world countries because we understand we're not the same. But if we do look at the countries where we can compare ourselves, we are really still hanging on the back end of these indicators. So there is definitely something for us to look into. And as you also mentioned, it's been like this for the past 5 years. So it's not that it's all of a sudden, oh my goodness, the ecosystem is not supporting entrepreneurs. It's been a systemic long-term thing. And this is the problem. It's not going to change overnight. This is going to need a proper intervention, and it's going to take years before we get to where we want to be and at a 5.8 or a 6.1 like some of our counterpart countries in the world.
And that's a great starting point, just to understand exactly, what we're working with here. The panel of roughly 60 experts through this population-wide survey of business owners, I think it's a really good sample and cohort. And even though these are perception scores, I think they correlate quite closely with harder outcomes like new business formation, survival rates, employment growth, all of that we see in the South African ecosystem. Angus, let's move to government here because, and you mentioned it earlier, there's strong desire amongst government institutions to support SMEs and entrepreneurships. But there's many a slip twixt cup and lip, as they say. And you say that the country doesn't primarily need more policy or necessarily more funding. It needs political will and institutional discipline. What in practical terms does that political will mean here? Which decisions are currently not being taken that really would make a big impact in the ecosystem?
So if you take a small agency like SETFA, they have 13 billion rand a year they can put towards building the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So, and 13 billion rand is a sizable amount of money. And they don't know how to do that. As much as I work with SETFA, Natanya works with SETFA, they're amazing people that work there. They just don't know how to execute that. And so the waste in that system is so huge. And something has to happen there to reinforce that distribution of funds, to make sure that those funds go towards building productive businesses. And I don't think government are good at doing that. They are good at thinking about policy, and they're very good about thinking about what should we do, but they're not very good at execution. So I think they need third parties to execute that.
Let's just build on that. How many government funding agencies are out there at the moment? Because there also seems to be a certain amount of overlap and fragmentation in the ecosystem. And I know in the report you recommend a single digital access point for government programs. So how important is it to solve this idea of A, capacity to be able to disperse the funds in an effective manner, and B, that route to market?
I can give you an example. There is a fund in the Western Cape that is totally dedicated towards sponsorships. It's 500 million rand, and no one's taken it up. Because the reason why is the regulatory environment. So people don't want to go and register their businesses because it's too onerous.
Yeah.
There needs to be a new way to think about small business. Small business doesn't need the same regulation as Pick n Pay.
Yeah, I think, Angus, you're 100% spot on. And as we spoke earlier before the actual recording or the interview started, I mentioned to you, Michael, that I've done quite a few interviews since this report was launched. And each and every single time that I was waiting in the waiting room, there's news flashes, etc., of what's going on in the country. And every single thing that we've actually presented in our report is not only challenges for businesses, but it's challenges for the daily population and for people, just trying to go about their lives. Stuff like infrastructure totally collapsing and decay. We've seen that. I mean, that is something that's been here for years. This is one of the biggest things that we see in our report. Physical infrastructure was the factor that dropped the most from 2024 to 2025. So, the biggest drop in percentage points. And corruption, we're seeing that. If a small business, yesterday I spoke on an interview and they asked about access to entry and access to markets. And one of the things we picked up there was that a lot of these small, let's not say micro, but let's say small to medium businesses are finding it extremely difficult to get access to some of the markets where the funds and the money and the workload is available because of corruption and because of things that's not going the way it should be. So there's many of these things that unfortunately does not only affect businesses, but also, the day-to-day population that we really need to look on. And this is sort of in the highlight now leading up to the elections. I think we're seeing it in every news line, headline, newspaper, TV ad, whatever.
And municipal government, local government appears repeatedly in the report through licensing, through zoning, through infrastructure collapse, trading permits, local procurement. I mean, the problem, and speaking, quite frankly here, the problem is really about the basics of government collapsing and businesses having to try and negotiate the daily grind of running a business through that collapse before we even start talking about effective programs to help fund SMEs, anything like that. How does one begin to reverse the sequence? I don't know if anyone's gotten any ideas. I know at a national level, there's a metro trading reform that's currently being discussed and underway. But do you think we need to, given this, maybe Angus, you can build on this idea, do we just need to start thinking differently about the way we regulate small businesses and, to not expect them to operate under the same regulatory burden as larger enterprises, be it in labor, be it in licensing, compliance, all of those things that larger firms have teams of people and departments dedicated to?
100%. I mean, there's no ways that you can have a single regime. It's impossible. You want the small guys, the small traders, the small businesses in the townships, in the informal sector to pay tax. Of course you want that. So work out a way that allows them to get into the system without being threatened by, without being threatened, actually. There needs to be a different regime. If you go to Indonesia, you go to India, they have different regimes across different parts of the market. We have to do that, because the amount of trade that happens in the informal sector is enormous. All you've got to do is bring them into the system in a way that makes sense. And they will come into the system because that also protects them, as companies, as organizations. But they can't come into the system under the burden of pick and pay. It's not going to happen.
Now, a phrase that says that successful entrepreneurs learn to master the bureaucracy, which in itself, it's a useful reality, but it just, we risk shifting responsibility back onto entrepreneurs, effectively saying that, the maze is dysfunctional, but the better founder will learn to run through it faster. We so often, Natanya, speak of moving informal businesses into the formal economy, but why should an entrepreneur formalize when formalization adds cost and risk without reliably providing the requisite finance and infrastructure or market access?
Yeah, so I think exactly that what you said. Why should they formalize? So there'll always be a percentage of small businesses, micro businesses that will never formalize. And when I mean formalize, formally register with all the different legal facilities that they have to by law in our country. And unfortunately, there's nothing you can do about that. I mean, you can't go and police and patrol every single trader on the street corner or spaza shop like you earlier mentioned. It's just not going to be possible. But when we look at those ones who's actually in the process of growing and the ones who's now seeing that their product or service is actually, worthwhile and people are spending money on it, sales are increasing, they're getting more orders. Eventually those companies or businesses, let's call them businesses, companies sound so very formalized, and this is probably the topic we are on now. We want them to, they are employing more people, and to legalize them and to get the benefit out of some of these aspects, they will need to formalize. I referred earlier on specifically when, these small companies wants to become part of the supply chains of bigger companies, like Angus mentioned, the Pick and Pays or the ShopRite's, Checkers, whatever, or for example, filling in municipal tenders, that type of things that unfortunately at this stage is really, really very corrupt in some areas. They need to formalize. To get that benefit, they need to. But then again, if there is so much red tape and bureaucracy that if you don't have the exact set of directors and you don't have the exact number of people employed and you don't have the exact address or whatever the case may be, and all of these restrictions are by any case default prohibiting you from getting benefits from these bigger contracts, at the end of the day, it's not worth it. The other thing is, and we spoke about that earlier on in another interview, if you actually get to a point where you have legalized and formalized everything, that you are in a position to put in a tender or something like that, and you do get the job. Let's say you've managed to get to that point. Now you have to wait 30, 60, 90 days for your money from some of these organizations. And I'm specifically referring to government organizations. No small businesses in their life can afford to wait for a big contract for the money they've already put in for 30, 60 or 90 days. And that's what we see.
Yeah, the Western Cape have made a pledge, 30 days.
Yeah.
And they stick to it. They pay their suppliers on 30 days. And the rest of the country should do the same. You know?
Yeah. And it's just not worth for an entrepreneur to go into that pipeline and that supply chain if there's so much negative.
We are part of a project right now in the Western Cape. They paid us on 30 days.
Yeah. And we delivered.
So
it was both sides.
Yeah. The other thing for me is that any small business that turns less than 10 million should not pay tax. Now that's radical. Okay. I understand that. But that will drive the growth of small businesses. 10 million rand is not a lot of money anymore, you know?
Yeah.
But 10 million rand should be the threshold, in my opinion, before you pay tax. Then people will comply. They will definitely comply. But I mean, what government would do that? You know, our government is not ready for that kind of radical thought, you know? But it's the right thing to do. Set a threshold when you don't pay tax, you know, and 10 million rand is not a lot of money anymore.
Yeah, and exactly, maybe not pay tax at a corporate level, but think about all of the employee tax, PAYE, and the other tax that small business
Exactly. You pay all those taxes.
Producing for the fiscus. It speaks to our broader policy incoherence. I mean, often you hear at a national level through State of the Nation addresses and others that unemployment is one of our top priorities in terms of addressing poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Yet our policies don't necessarily reflect that urgency in the way that they're designed. I want to just move on, if we can, Natanya, to how we finance small businesses. And, you know, if you look at it, our entrepreneurial finance score is 4. Well, ease of access is even weaker than that. I mean, it's a striking contradiction in a country with highly developed banks and capital markets. And I've seen lots of fintechs spring up here over the last decade, offering, you know, invoice lending, maybe looking at alternative data sets to understand a township entrepreneur's cash flow. Just recently on the podcast, we interviewed one of the lead transactors on an RMB structure of R1 billion blended finance program with Endlu, where they're on lending capital to township property entrepreneurs so that they can build backroom houses. But it was very innovative. Is the problem that we're just, because it doesn't seem to be genuinely a shortage of capital, it does look like we don't have the requisite desire from the formal financial sector to innovate and meet entrepreneurs where they are. Would you say that's a fair assessment? And how do we reverse that?
Yeah, I think, you know, we should be honest with ourselves and not just say that it is overall a finance problem. And because what is the first barrier any entrepreneur who's not growing is telling you? There's no money, he's not getting money. So I'm yet to be convinced that money is the answer to, you know, solve all the problems. Some people get huge fundings, huge grants, and then they still don't succeed. So I think let's move back a bit. We've got a lot of good products out there. And you've mentioned a few of these fintechs and a few of these finance institutions. Over the last few days with all of these talking about this, I've been Googling and trying to see what products are out there other than the mainstream ones. And there's quite a lot of products out there. So firstly, we have the products. Okay, maybe not enough and maybe not covering all the bases. For example, I would like to see more blended instruments where grants and loans are combined, where finance organizations should launch stage appropriate collateral light products and pre-seed through growth. And this is something we're missing. You know, where do we get these small companies or small micro enterprises that do not have the correct collateral to apply for these things? How do we get them to move? And of course, there will be some risk to it. And this is where organizations such as SETFA with money to be spent needs to come in to say that, okay, we are prepared to seed fund a very, very small business to a certain extent. And on the delivery of certain growth targets, we will increase this. So but there's always a chance that some of this money will be written off. So we need to see more of that. Then I think sometimes there's a lot of entrepreneurs out there that's not familiar with all of these products. So sometimes it's a disconnect between what's available and what do I know of. And we need to remember that often, and we've tested this, one of the questions we also ask in some of our research on this gem is, do you know about some of the support systems out there to help small businesses? And a lot of people don't know about it. So again, it's a disconnect from what is available and what do I know? And if I know about it, do I understand how to apply for it? And if I apply for it, do I get feedback? Because this is also a thing. Sometimes people actually know about these institutions that provide finance. They go through all the trouble of submitting applications and then they just don't hear anything. You need to follow up month by month by month. So people get this belief in the system because sometimes, again, the service delivery. So there's a lot of things going on. So there's no, and this is why we call it an ecosystem. There's no one thing to pinpoint to say, if we fix this, it's going to be better next year. If we fix, all of these things needs to work together. And then what I also want to say, I don't always want to just focus on the negative. There's definitely pockets of excellence. You can talk to lots of entrepreneurs who actually did manage to get access to finance and who did manage to have the right collateral and get through the process, and which the money they got through a grant or through any finance institution actually assisted them in growing. So there is those success stories, and there's many of them, but not enough. These smaller entrepreneurs where you have this collateral problem, and I think this is the biggest thing. This is where we need to say and sit and say, how do we help these small ones to just double up in size? I mean, if you're selling 1,000 Rand turnover a month, let's get you to 2,000. If you have one employee, let's get you to 2 employees. And eventually, if that growth, starts escalating, they won't need the funding anymore. So I think this is where the problem is. And we're moving back again to this very micro township type of, rural, peri-urban type of environments.
Michael, my view is that finance is not the problem.
Yeah.
Not many people agree with me, okay? So for me, the biggest challenge for entrepreneurship is markets. Is there a market? Is there an attributable market or not? Whether it be whatever you're doing, you're manufacturing or you're selling, or markets make entrepreneurship, not finance. Secondly, most entrepreneurs don't understand finance. They don't know when to employ it. They don't know what to employ it for. They're mostly misguided on finance. Second, the most important thing about after markets is talent. What does your team look like? And thirdly, the most important thing after that is probably luck. So that for me, markets, talent, luck is more important than finance, in my opinion. And those companies that have gone from zero to hero have those 3 things.
Yeah, as I said, there is more than enough capital out there.
Yeah.
And the report touches on, our really low scores when it comes to entrepreneurship in education and skills, and building that culture of entrepreneurship in the school environment as well. I'm very privileged in that my daughter's got a private schools. They have market days every quarter. Why? Because they're building and flexing and developing that entrepreneurial muscle. That doesn't clearly happen in the public sector. Natanya, as we end off, and your roadmap operates across 3 horizons, all of which must begin simultaneously. There just isn't time to build these things in series. Who should own the national entrepreneurship ecosystem? Because it seems to me that, again, there's just too much fragmentation. You've got the presidency, you've got the Department of Small Business Development, you've got CEDFA, you've got the TTIC. What do we need to do to start turning this thing around?
It's extremely complex. And as you rightfully mentioned, it can't just be one institution or organization. It needs to be a combination of all these stakeholders that are included in the ecosystem. And of course, for something like this to manage in a country that's mostly unmanaged at many levels, it's going to take a miracle or few. So this is why we are very fond of research institutions within universities who partner up with some of these organizations. And we are seeing this. I've got a lot of good examples where university projects and university programs have actually partnered up with local government institutions or local government for that matter and sort of brought them together. And a lot has happened. But to be honest, it's not going to happen overnight. You spoke about this 3 horizons recommendations that we have in here. And this isn't something phenomenal that we came up. This is the basics. I mean, the first horizon, maybe I'll talk a little bit through it just so that our listeners are on the same page as what you and I are referring to. But our first horizon is, and it's at this stage, the most damaging constraint on South African entrepreneurs, but also, in my opinion, one of the most easiest fixable ones. And this is to sort out the red tape, bureaucracy, fragmentation, procurement barriers, all of these things. Because if we can get those things aligned, access and formality and those type of things will be easier for businesses. And that's the quickest thing to do. We've got all these policies there. They're there. Lots of them are written extremely well. However, a lot of them are also written very much for established, higher, bigger businesses, and also on a very much westernized, developed country perspective. So they are sometimes problematic, but they are there and they are good, if you want to argue like that. But the implementation thereof is terrible. And as I say, often entrepreneurs get to these programs or projects or assistance or skills training or whatever you want to call it, because there's so many out there. But then getting into that and navigating the complexities around that just makes them give up. Because you mentioned earlier, you have to fight 6 or 7 things as a small business that's not in the textbook. I'm an entrepreneurship teacher. I teach students entrepreneurship. So we have our theory textbooks and we teach them market access. You need finance. You need a good business plan. You need a good team. All of these things. Those are the normal stuff. But before our entrepreneurs can even get to those textbook things, they have to battle 6 or 7 or other hurdles that's not in the textbooks that we teach our students. So that's the first thing. I mentioned blended finance earlier. That's extremely important. Then if we move to the second horizon, the infrastructure. This is a huge, huge, huge problem. And as I say, this is not only a problem for businesses, it's a problem for everyone in our country. Access to clean water, access to running water for that matter, access to proper roads where you can move your product from point A to point B and have a proper working supply chain where you don't have people hijacking your trucks all the way. So all of these things are extremely important. And then the last thing, and that's unfortunately the thing that will take the longest, is where we look at building a national culture. We need to shift the culture.
Yeah.
South Africa scores a 4 out of 10 if you look at social and cultural norms. We are a very diverse country. We know this. We call the Rainbow Nation. There's a lot of cultures, a lot of beliefs. But in a lot of cases, some people just don't think entrepreneurship is the way to go. And we need to shift this perspective to say that entrepreneurs are here to help our economy grow, build our future, solve problems, bring unemployment to a halt, and all of these things. And this is unfortunately something that will take longer than just, 1 or 2 changes here or there.
Yeah.
So it's a combination of various stakeholders, but someone needs to take the steering wheel, and that needs to be a very, very strong department, and I can't give you the answer on who it is now, because I don't think there is such one organization or committee or something that can do this. It will, for many years to come, still be very siloed, but at the end of the day, every win is a win in the right direction, I would say.
Yeah, and it just reminds me of what the president said at one of his first investment conferences back in 2018. He invited Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, to South Africa. Alibaba is one of the most successful Chinese businesses startup. He was a teacher as well. And he said, how did we do it in China? We made entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship sexy. We made the entrepreneurs the hero. We said, this is a vocation. This is how you serve your community, your country. And everyone wanted to become an entrepreneur. We don't need another speech about entrepreneurs being the backbone of the economy. We need to stop breaking their backs in South Africa. And
exactly.
I think the people, the ideas and the ambition are already here. I think what the report is really showing is that missing ingredients is the machinery.
What China did very well, China invested in education.
Yeah.
They invested big in education. People think the stereotype of Chinese is like making little plastic toys. They are engineers of note.
Yeah.
You know,
Human capital.
they have invested, they send their best minds to the best universities in America, you know, and they invest in their own universities. They are an incredibly sophisticated society, but they believe in education. And that's what turned them around. China was, at some point in history, the most successful country in the world. They're a very sophisticated society, but they believe in education. That's my point, really.
Angus,
Yeah.
thank
Yeah.
you very much.
Yeah.
We're going to have to leave it there. That score, that 3.9 out of 10, trailing the global average of 4.7, is just simply the accumulated result of choices, and choices can be changed. So that heartens me, but only if entrepreneurship stops being treated as a side project for the unemployed and starts being treated as a national growth strategy. My thanks to Angus Bowmaker-Falconer and Professor Natanya Meyer for unpacking the 2026 Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, the GEM National Expert Special Report on South Africa. Do yourself a favor, download a copy. Very interesting reading indeed. You've been listening to the Monocle Banking Podcast, curated by Monocle Solutions. I'm Michael Avery. Until next time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share amongst your network. Take care.